In this particular talk, we're going to have a look at the use of sound within games and some of the things we may want to consider when we're planning how we'll use sound within our own particular game development. We'll start off first of all with giving you basically an overview of how sound is used and the importance of it within games. There's three primary or different uses of sound within games. The first one is in terms of the music that's played within the game, and quite often this is something that helps establish mood within the game in terms of it could be a piece of music that is relaxed or one that is upbeat, one that tries to sort of indicate a sense of urgency or concern. Alongside that, we're using sound to provide sound effects. So these are generally short-lived sounds that are tied to events that have happened within the game. So it could be a door closing, a projectile exploding, a step falling on the ground. So anything where you have an incidental short-lived sound, we would classify that as a sound effect. And finally, not least though, we can also, depending on the game, have dialogue where different characters may wish to talk, communicate with one another. And again, we use that by way of improving realism or immersion within the game. Sound is something we quite often take for granted, but it actually plays a remarkably important role in determining how immersive a particular gaming experience is. So for example, if you had a character walking but you didn't have footfall sounds, so depending on the surface that they're walking over, there wasn't the sound of their foot hitting and moving across the ground, a person may not notice it immediately, but the actual appearance, the scene will not appear natural. Something will appear wrong with it. So sound is something quite often we do take for granted, that if it is there, we will accept it, we won't notice it, but it will help to improve how immersive the environment is. If we don't have it, then the opposite happens. We can often feel there's something not quite right here, even if we can't clearly put our finger on what we perceived or listen or hear to be the difference. So let's have a look about how we can manage playback of sound within our games. In terms of the hardware devices that we're using, or sound chips that we have within the mobile devices, router-related ones, they will be able to output a number of channels. So a channel is one particular playback of a piece of sound. Now you could have one channel for music, or if you have stereo left and right, be two channels. Sound eclipse, then you may have different sort of channels being used to play back different types of sound. So they are played simultaneously and they can be blended together and combined in different ways. And that gives us, if you like, our fundamental basis on which we actually play back sound. So let's have a look at how we can make a soundscape within a game. Here we have a simple screenshot. And if you think about, well, what sounds might we have being played within that environment, we could come up with the following plausible list. So we might have the sound of some people talking. We could have some people walking about with some footfall sounds occurring. We might have some special effects, say for example water sounds. And we might have some background music. Now there may be a couple of channels for each of these depending if we do have a stereo effect, and if you add them up you'll go, well, there's not too many channels here, it's a reasonable number. And for this type of game, sure, you may only be using 7, 8, 9, 10 different channels by way of your audio playback. But let's have a look now at a slightly different example. In this case here, it's a top-down action game, and we could, for example, imagine a situation where every projectile that hits will play a hit sound or an explosion sound depending on what happens. And if you look at the number of things that is potentially happening on screen, potentially we could have an awful lot of sounds being continuously played. And the hardware sure may be able to manage this, but you may end up with a particularly messy soundscape with too many sounds all trying to be played at the same time. So how might we manage that type of environment? There's different ways of managing it. There's no one right way, but one particular approach is to use a quota-based system, where depending on the device we might assume we've got 32 channels that we can potentially play back across, and we'll have a budget for each of those channels. So we might say that for explosion sounds we're going to have a maximum of 6 channels that we would be willing to use. For projectiles, maybe 10 channels, and so on. Whatever arbitrary number seems appropriate for a game in question. If we have 6 explosions that are currently playing and we try to play a 7th, then there's a decision to be made in terms of, well, what do we do as a consequence of that? And quite often either use a priority or an edge-based setup that if all explosions are of the same priority, then the one that's been playing the longest, we could remove that and commence playback of the most recent explosion sound. So there is a way then of actually managing this so that we don't have too much or too many simultaneous playbacks of any particular sound. In terms of key takeaways from this, I've only got a couple of them. Audio, often we do take it for granted, but it is actually a very important aspect within a game to help establish mood, to help improve the immersion of the game. So it's something we should not discount. And from a coding perspective, playback of audio normally is quite straightforward. You've got a simple API, you can trigger the playback of these sounds whenever you want to, and for a lot of games that's all you need to do. For the odd game where there is potentially a lot of sound happening, then sometimes it's necessary to put a little bit of management to make sure that the sound is controlled in terms of its playback. But overall, reasonably simple, reasonably straightforward from a programmer's perspective. Nonetheless, it's important to carefully look at and to carefully design within our developments.